Let's be honest, most of us probably wouldn't last 5 minutes in the Viking era. Sure, watching shows like Vikings or The Last Kingdom makes the whole thing look epic. There are ships, axes, and long hair blowing in the wind. But if we actually had to live in the Viking Age, it would be more like, how fast can I go back to the 21st century? So grab your horned helmet. Just kidding, real Vikings didn't wear those. Sit back and let me explain why you'd be in serious trouble trying to survive with the real-life Vikings. Here are 6 reasons why you'd probably tap out of the Viking era in record time. You have no combat skills. Let's start with the most obvious one, fighting. If you were a Viking, fighting wasn't just something you did occasionally for fun. It was your lifestyle. Now, I know you might be thinking, hey, I've played Assassin's Creed Valhalla. I've got this. Let me stop you right there. Knowing how to push a few buttons on a controller doesn't exactly prepare you for the brutal, bloody reality of Viking combat. There's no respawn button in real life, folks. First off, Vikings didn't have the luxury of modern weapons. No guns, no fancy gadgets, just swords, axes, and spears. And these weren't lightweight, ergonomic weapons like in video games or movies. Viking weapons were heavy, and they required actual muscle to swing, especially in armor. You'd probably throw your back out just trying to lift an axe. That's before you even think about the fact that someone's trying to split your head open. Vikings also fought in shield walls. Picture this, a bunch of huge, angry dudes with shields are pushing against another group of huge, angry dudes with shields, all while stabbing each other with spears and hacking at limbs. You're supposed to hold your place in this human meat grinder without flinching. Meanwhile, you can't even stand still in a crowded elevator without getting awkward. And even if by some miracle you survived your first battle, you'd have to deal with constant raids. It wasn't like you just did one big fight and then went home to relax. Vikings were always raiding. You'd be trying to take a nap and someone would shout, "We're sailing off to pillage the monastery down the coast." And there you are, fumbling to put on your armor again. So yeah, you'd probably be dead within a week. At best, you'd end up as a nervous wreck, twitching every time someone mentions the word fight. The religion would freak you out. Vikings didn't worship one peaceful, loving god who just wants everyone to be nice. Nope. They had a whole pantheon of gods who were as violent, chaotic, and unpredictable as the Vikings themselves. Meet Odin, the one-eyed god of wisdom, war, and death. He hung himself from a tree for 9 days just to gain knowledge. Yeah, this guy wasn't exactly the cuddly grandpa type. Then there's Thor, the god of thunder, who smashed giants with his hammer for fun. The Vikings worshipped these gods because they believed life was short, brutal, and full of battles. They thought they'd end up in Valhalla, basically an eternal warrior heaven, if they died in combat. There, they could feast and fight forever. Sounds like fun, right? Until you realize the only way to get into Valhalla is to die in battle. So every Viking was low-key hoping to die violently, so they wouldn't be stuck with the losers in hell, the underworld, which was cold and boring. If you're someone who likes your Sunday brunches, meditation apps, and a nice calm life, Viking religion would be a nightmare. Imagine showing up to a Viking prayer circle, and they're all chanting about wanting to die with honored by getting their heads chopped off. Meanwhile, you're in the corner thinking, can we just, hope for peace? And good luck keeping up with all the sacrifices. Vikings believed in offering up animals, and sometimes people, to the gods for good fortune. You'd be at a Viking feast thinking it's all fun and games when suddenly everyone's dragging some poor goat to an altar, and you're just sitting there horrified. The climate would break you. Let's talk weather. Vikings lived in Scandinavia, which is stunning, but also freezing about 90% of the time. The summers were short, and the winters were long, dark, and cold. Not wear a cute jacket and post a selfie in the snow cold. More like my nose might fall off and my bones are frozen cold. You'd have to survive in this harsh climate without modern comforts. No heated homes, no electric blankets, and no Netflix to binge watch while you wait for spring. Vikings lived in long houses, which were basically wooden barns with a big fire in the middle. This fire was their only source of heat, and you'd be sharing the space with your entire family, plus the animals. Oh, and there are no chimneys, so the place would be full of smoke. You'd be choking on the fumes, your eyes watering, and yet somehow still freezing because the fire didn't reach the corners of the room. The constant cold and darkness would mess with your head. Seasonal depression? More like year-round depression. The sun might not come out for days during the winter, and you'd be stuck inside with nothing to do but chop wood, fix your weapons, and try not to lose your mind. And if you did have to go outside, you'd be bundled up in layers of wool, stumbling through knee-deep snow, while trying not to freeze to death. Also, did I mention that the Vikings were seafarers? They spent a lot of the time sailing across icy oceans in open wooden ships. Can you imagine being out at sea in the middle of a freezing storm, soaked to the bone, and trying not to fall overboard? Yeah, you'd probably be clinging to the nearest mast, screaming, "I want to go home!" while the Vikings laughed at your misery. You have 0 survival skills. Vikings were masters of survival. They farmed, hunted, fished, built their own homes, made their own clothes, and basically did everything for themselves. There was no popping down to the local grocery store or ordering stuff online. If you needed food, you had to grow it, catch it, or kill it. If you needed clothes, you had to make them from scratch, probably from the skin of some animal you personally owned. Now let's be real. Most of us today can't even keep a houseplant alive, let alone survive in the wilderness, with nothing but a knife and some rope. You'd be standing in the Viking village, looking at a pile of firewood, wondering how to even start a fire. Meanwhile, the Viking next to you is like, "Oh, I just chopped down this tree with my bare hands and built a boat. What's taking you so long?" Vikings knew how to track animals, navigate the seas, and make tools out of pretty much anything they found. You? You'd be lucky to figure out how to sharpen a stick without cutting yourself. And let's not even talk about the food situation. You'd have to gather and preserve food for the winter, which involved salting, smoking, or drying everything. And if you didn't do it right, you'd be looking at months of starving or worse, food poisoning. Also, forget about modern medicine. If you got sick or injured, the best you could hope for was some herbs and maybe a little prayer to the gods. Broken leg? Tough luck. The Viking healer might try to set the bone with a stick and some twine, but after that, you're on your own. Infections? Well, good luck with that too. You might be dead by the next morning. The diet would destroy you. Speaking of food, the Viking diet wasn't exactly a 5-star restaurant experience. Sure, they had feasts where they roasted pigs and drank mead, but that was for special occasions. Most of the time, the Viking diet was, well, kinda gross. Let's start with surströmming, a type of fermented fish that smells so bad it's been banned from some public places today. Vikings loved that stuff. You, on the other hand, would probably take one whiff and throw up. And if the fish wasn't fermented, it was salted. Vikings salted everything to preserve it, for the long winters, which meant most of your meals would taste like you're eating a chunk of ocean. When they weren't eating fish, Vikings survived on a diet of meat, dairy, and grains. Sounds okay, right? But keep in mind there was no refrigeration. Dairy would spoil quickly. Most of the grain would be tough, chewy bread that could probably double as a weapon. And if the crops failed or the hunting didn't go well, let's just say Vikings weren't above eating whatever was available. You might end up gnawing on some questionable stew, wondering if that meat, quote-unquote, was actually just a squirrel that got a little too close to the house. If you're used to greens, smoothies, and avocado toast, Viking meals would be a rude awakening. It would be all heavy, greasy food that sit in your stomach like a rock, and if you couldn't digest it, too bad. There were no Pepto-Bismol or antacids to help you out. The punishments were brutal. Finally, let's talk about Viking justice. Vikings had laws, but their punishments were about as far from modern-day courtrooms as you can get. Forget paying a fine or doing community service. In the Viking era, if you broke the law, you were in for some serious pain. If you stole something, you might have your hand chopped off. And if you really messed up, they could banish you from the community, which basically meant a death sentence because you wouldn't survive on your own. Worse still, if you committed a particularly heinous crime, you might face the dreaded blood eagle. This was a brutal execution method where they would cut open your back, pull out your lungs, and drape them over your shoulders like wings. Yeah, Vikings didn't mess around. The legal system also wasn't exactly fair. Sometimes, disputes were settled by holmgang, which was basically a duel to the death. So even if you were technically in the right, if the other guy was better at axe swinging, you were toast. You'd be trying to explain your side of the story and the Vikings would just hand you a sword and say, "Good luck." And let's be real, you'd probably mess up at some point. Maybe you'd accidentally offend someone by drinking their mead, or maybe you'd just be bad at farming and someone would blame you for a bad harvest. Either way, you'd end up in front of the Viking council, sweating buckets while they decided your fate. You'd probably be begging for mercy, and they'd just laugh saying, "Welcome to the Viking Age." Conclusion. So there you have it. 6 solid reasons why you wouldn't survive the Viking era. Between the brutal combat, terrifying religion, freezing climate, lack of survival skills, awful diet, and savage punishments, you'd be in over your head. Sure, it's fun to imagine sailing on a long ship with a sword in hand, but the reality would be way less glamorous. You'd probably be hiding in the corner, trying not to freeze to death while the real Vikings did all the hard work. So maybe stick to watching Vikings on TV, where the closest thing to danger is running out of popcorn.